capitalism in China has thrived under an authoritarian regime and a strong state. It is also flourishing in India, but in this case it's a democratic regime and a state that is relatively much less strong compared to its Chinese counterpart. So what I want to do is to basically think with you about the distinctive features of like capitalism with Chinese characteristics and those with Indian characteristics, so to speak, and also whether they offer any like models or typologies for the varieties of capitalism that are likely to emerge in other developing countries, and particularly their relationship to the types of political structures. Now, if you begin with China, right? China's spectacular rise. There are, of course, many proximate factors of its economic success, which are very much in line with conventional models of economic growth. Massive savings, huge investment rates in physical and human capital, political stability, capitalism and markets are incentives, and economics are integration with the world economy. But there are also many features which strongly question some of our current shibboleths on development thinking. The first, of course, is the degree and intensity of state intervention. It is striking just how interventionist the Chinese state has been and continues like to be. This is not just about the central government. If you look at local and municipal governments, it is incredible that it is hard to see where the boundaries of firms end and where the boundaries of the state begin. It is a state that is relentless about meeting its goals, whatever the cost. Means matter much less than ends. This is, I think, one reason why the Chinese firms have such optimistic forward expectations, and in turn they invest at mind-boggling rates even in such hard times. And last week there was an interesting commentary in the People's Daily from Beijing, which basically argued that the reason for the country's economic miracle is because its leaders can make quick, and I emphasize the word quick, decisions, and ensure that underlings carry them out. Now, this was, of course, in contrast not just with plodding Western-type capitalism, but I shall argue very much in contrast to India, where decision-making is anything but quick, and the idea that underlings will carry out anything is a very optimistic expectation. A second sort of shibboleth which you see, of course, much in vogue in World Bank thinking and so on and so forth, is transparency. And I think after this week's saga of Google in China, let's say its transparency is not China's strongest card. We all expected that the internet, power of information, would sort of reshape this within China, but instead you actually have the most sweeping web filtering system anywhere in the world. In fact, you could argue that modern communication technology has allowed China to achieve a centralized bureaucracy that has a much smaller chance of becoming overextended and top-heavy. Another thing which you see in the development literature is participation. You see this all the time, good projects, everything. It's a bit like everyone around a campfire and deliberating about their development prospects. Well, participation, as the People's Daily commentary said, their decision-making is quick and swift, which means there is no participation. Corruption. China and, as I shall argue, India, both are acutely corrupt countries. It's hard to know which is more corrupt, but let's say they're both equally very, very corrupt. Rule of law. Conventional wisdom is that a market economy requires the rule of law, which in turn requires institutional curbs on government. In China's case, the Communist Party's monopoly power means that whatever institutional curbs on government that exist are going to be self-restrained. They're not going to be institutional. The democracy. There's a recent article in a popular magazine in the US, and the title is called, "What Makes a Nation Rich? One Economist's Big Answer." And then it goes on, and I'm just quoting. "Say you're a world leader and you want your country's economy to prosper. According to this Clark Medal winner from MIT, there's a simple solution. Start with free elections." Now, I wonder if the Chinese leadership saw this article and said to themselves, damn, why didn't we think of this? Now, I think some features of Chinese capitalism, you could argue, and this is a very obviously contentious argument, is really very mercantilist. It's hard to see the Chinese exchange rate and not conclude that it is, that the sheer volumes of current account surpluses that China is enjoying, the type of capitalism that is prevailing in China is what sort of prevailed in parts of Europe, 18th and 19th centuries. As someone wrote, the Chinese Communist Party is probably the world's most powerful multinational corporation. So, what about the Indian story? Well, it starts off perhaps a little more promising in the beginning, but I'll argue has some other but different and worse problems than China. In the late 1950s, André Malraux, who was a French intellectual and culture minister, wrote to Nehru, who was the then Indian Prime Minister, and he asked him what was the biggest challenge that he faced in running or managing India. And Nehru sort of like wrote back in a sort of letter, and yes, I mean, I know it sounds a bit arcane that people actually wrote letters in those days, saying, and he replied, and I think it's a very, very telling reply. He said, "My biggest challenge is building a just society with just means." And the Indian experiment, in a sense, tried that, or has been trying that, right? And the just means, of course, is trying to build a very, very poor society, very diverse one, huge one, through democratic means. And until about the 1980s, by and large, the world saw the Indian experience was interpreted as an outcome of the trade-off between democracy and growth in a poor country. Now, of course, this has changed in some recent years as India has grown very rapidly. Now, the contrast with China is interesting on several dimensions. One is, it's ironic that democratic India has done or performed much less well than authoritarian China, not just in growth, but on poverty and human development. And in fact, I think one could make a reasonable argument that the very legitimacy of the Indian state through the electoral process puts less pressure on it to perform compared to the Chinese state, for whom performance is the only form of seeking legitimacy. It must perform because that is the only way it is legitimate. In India, the state, so what if you perform poorly? Because you are elected, you have an alternative mechanism of seeking legitimacy. As I said, democratic India is at least, if not more, corrupt than China. But processes and procedures, means matter much more in India than in China, in part because it has a powerful independent judiciary. And there's a quip that the Indian state has the engine of a bullock cart and the brakes of a Rolls Royce, and the Chinese state has the engine of a Rolls Royce and the brakes of a bullock cart. But these contrasting roles of the state, I think, are built around something which is fundamentally different in China compared to India, and I think is sort of unique to China, which is different from the way we think of institutions, the way the economics literature in particular thinks of institution, which is the Chinese state has a political party, bar none.